Canada's Great Lakes have been linked to many strange and unexplained mysteries. The solitary existence of a lighthouse keeper has intrigued the imagination of people for generations. These lonely towers are the perfect setting for a ghost story, and Toronto's Gibraltar Point is no exception. In the summer of 1895, George Durant was hired to be the lighthouse keeper at Gibraltar Point. Operating a lighthouse is a lonely job, but for George it was perfect. He loved the peace and solitude the position offered. Durant had been on the job a short time when he began hearing footsteps coming up the circular staircase of the lighthouse. Each time he heard the footsteps, he would investigate, and each time he found no one on the steps.
Some theorize that there have been events which are so tragic in nature that they have become stuck in time for all eternity, with spirits condemned to repeat these horrific moments again and again. But can a spirit not only relive the past, but alter the present? Minutes from modern-day Toronto sits Gibraltar Lighthouse, where some say a ghost did just that.
One afternoon, while looking down from the lighthouse, Durant witnessed a bloodied, armless man who looked like he had been in a horrible accident. He quickly ran down the stairs to give aid to the man. But when he reached the base, this armless man had vanished. Sometime later, while enjoying a quiet moment at the top of the lighthouse, Durant had the feeling he was not alone. Turning, he found himself face to face with the armless figure. He saw the armless figure again one afternoon while performing maintenance, and again the figure disappeared. Durant ran to the railing where he saw the bloody figure at the base of the lighthouse. It seemed to Durant as if the man wanted him to follow. Durant ran down the stairs and saw the figure standing a short distance away. For a brief moment, they made eye contact. Durant could no longer deny that he was dealing with a ghost. He felt the ghost was trying to communicate with him. But why? And what was the message? Searching for an answer to the ghost's appearances, Durant decided to go through the old lighthouse logs. Many of the entries were by John Rayton Mueller, who had been the lighthouse keeper from 1809 until his mysterious disappearance in 1815. As he read the log entries, it became apparent to Durant that Mueller had enjoyed his position very much. Durant also learned Mueller had sold bootleg whiskey from the lighthouse to earn extra money. One day, two local thugs pounded on the lighthouse door. No one can say for sure what the motive for the visit was. Did they want to buy whiskey, or were they there to rob Mueller? After a brief exchange of words, Mueller decided he did not want to do business with them. The two thugs gave Mueller a savage beating. One of them decided to take things further. And in a brutal attempt to convince him to see things their way, they chopped his arms off, killing Mueller. The two thugs searched the lighthouse, but all they found was one bottle of whiskey. Now they had to find a way to cover up their brutal crime. They decided Mueller's body would be hacked to pieces, wrapped in burlap, and then buried on the island. The two were later arrested and charged with murder. However, they were cleared of any wrongdoing and released because the body of John Radin Mueller was never found. As George Durant read the final log entries by Mueller, he again saw the figure at the base of the lighthouse, and it all fell into place. He ran to the spot where the armless ghost had been standing. There he found an empty bootlegger's bottle. Digging feverishly, Durant made a gruesome discovery. Although Durant never told authorities how he found the body, as a result of his discovery, the two suspects were arrested, charged, and convicted of Mueller's murder. The spirit of John Radin Mueller continued to be seen by George Durant, but when he appeared, he was no longer a tortured, disfigured soul. To this very day, he can be seen wandering Toronto's Gibraltar Point and the park that now houses his beloved lighthouse. It seems that Mueller decided long ago to remain close to the only place on Earth he considered his home. On a beautiful Prince Edward Island day, at the King's Playhouse in Georgetown, two actors were on stage, rehearsing a scene for an upcoming performance. The actors were shocked at the vision. The two ran off after their brief encounter with the captain.
King's Playhouse has had a torrid history, burdened by tragedy and lifted through victory, and within these walls, part of that history lives on in the form of a resident phantom.
A theater custodian was performing her nightly duties. She was responsible for seeing that the auditorium was put back in order after a performance. As she crossed the stage, she heard a faint whistling. As she stopped to listen, the whistling faded away. Perplexed, she continued on her way through the auditorium. At first glance, all appeared orderly, at least at first glance. She found herself under the stern scrutiny of the captain. Another had been witness to Captain George.
The King's Playhouse is a replica of the one which was destroyed by a major fire in the winter of 1983. A couple of the stories that I've heard personally is that after a violent storm, this captain who was shepherding the good ship washed ashore here, crawled up and managed to make it the shores of Georgetown. And it is believed that his presence inhabits this facility.
With the burning down of the theatre, the recreated or rebuilt facility was very, very similar in fashion and style to the old one. Story has it then that the ghosts that occupied this building were satisfied and decided to stay and are still here. What seems to have happened is originally the railroad was here, and this area which the theatre now sits on was at one time known as Kent County, and contained also the graveyards from the oldest church on the island, which is just across the way there. And with the building and construction that went on as the town grew in its early days, story has it that several souls and their graves were disturbed and took occupancy here in the theatre.
On May 22nd, 2003, the town formally adopted a resolution stating that we wanted to name our resident phantom, our resident spirit. We called him Captain George.
During rehearsal, the sound technician sat at her station, awaiting her cues. What she did not expect was the presence of the captain at this particular performance. As she was going through her cues, she felt uneasy, as if she was being watched. The source of her discomfort seemed to be coming from over her left shoulder. When she looked, she saw the captain sitting in his newly appointed seat. Nervously, she returned to her work, and Captain George continued to enjoy the performance.
An interesting event was the fact that the town council decided that the captain, rather than having to occupy whichever seat happened to be available for him so he could enjoy the show, passed a motion in council. And that motion was the chair be separated from the auditorium and placed in a particular spot for the sole and only use of the captain, thereby satiating this spirit during our shows. We do ask, therefore, that people, when they enter the auditorium, please don't occupy the captain's seat. It might upset him and therefrom upset our shows. But the ritual is carried on and the legend is carried on, and we thank the captain for allowing us into his theatre.
It is not yet known why the captain has chosen this theater as his home. One can only wonder if the official town declaration and his ever-reserved seat will keep him sitting here at the King's Playhouse eternally. A Thunder Bay couple rented a boat for a visit to White Otter Castle. They had heard so much about the isolated castle, but neither had been there before. They had planned to spend the day. It turned out to be the longest day of their lives. As the two became separated, Susan heard rustling in the trees. She had lost her bearings and called out to her boyfriend, Jake. There was no response, so she continued on. Susan felt uneasy, as if something was following her. Susan ran in terror after she saw a strange man suddenly appear out of nowhere. She ran as fast as she could, trying to outrun the strange man who was chasing her. The ghostly apparition pursued her. The ghostly stalker ceased his pursuit. It looked as though she had outrun whatever was pursuing her. Susan and Jake eventually found each other. She was shaking, apparently shocked. Jake attempted to calm her. Something had seriously frightened her.
Nestled in the beautiful landscape of northern Ontario, amongst the abundant pines and rivers, stands a structure that may oddly seem out of place. In the midst of a forest, a 3-story log castle rises through the trees on the shore of White Otter Lake near the town of Ignis. This magnificent building was constructed by a man often referred to as the Hermit of White Otter Lake.
The castle was built by Jimmy McHewett. Rumor was that he was a Scotsman. He's of Scottish ancestry, but he was actually born in the eastern townships of Quebec. And in the late 1800s, he traveled by CP rail in the newly constructed railway to what was then Rat Portage, which is now Kenora on Lake of the Woods. And from then he went by steamer to Rainy River and homesteaded there. And then about the turn of the last century, he decided he had enough. He was doing well in farming, but he sold the farm, put all his money into his grub stake and went gold prospecting. And somewhere around 1900, 1902, 3, he ended up in White Otter Lake.
It was to be here, away from people, 30 miles and 17 portages from the nearest town, where Jimmy McHewett would build this unlikely monument. McHewett built this castle entirely by himself. 17 years later, this log castle would be finished. It is thought Jimmy built the White Otter for his young bride. Unfortunately, she was thousands of miles away in Scotland, but she was to join him soon. He wanted to build a majestic home for himself and his new wife, a castle for his queen. He continued to build, anticipating her arrival. As the castle grew, so did his impatience. His obsession began to eat at him, and soon this castle would consume him. His bride never came. In 1921, the body of Jimmy McKeown was discovered when it washed up on the shore of White Otter Lake. His death was considered suspicious. No one knows how Jimmy drowned in the waters of the lake. Jimmy McKeown was buried in a grave adjacent to his castle. There are tales told around campfires of Jimmy eternally wandering the grounds of White Otter Castle. The couple walked down to where the boat was docked, only to find that it was no longer there. They were now stranded. Forced to stay, they cautiously entered the castle. Jake assured his girlfriend everything would be fine. He could not have been more wrong. Jake stopped when he heard footsteps above him. Susan was frightened and did not want to be left alone. She quickly decided to join her boyfriend upstairs. Left without transportation and with the only shelter already occupied, they had no other choice than to spend the night on the beach. The next morning, they awoke to a pleasant and relieving surprise. The boat was exactly where they had left it the previous day. Discussion of the events was far from their minds. They simply wanted off this island. Exhausted and confused, they loaded the boat for the return trip home, leaving behind the castle and the hermit who still dwells there. White Otter Castle is on the shores of White Otter Lake, 80 kilometers north of Antikokan, Ontario. While off the beaten path, White Otter Castle is accessible to the public even today. Over a century ago, railroad baron William McKenzie built the house of his dreams in Kirkfield, a quaint town in rural Ontario. This house is now a beautiful country inn. A desk clerk was starting his first shift at the McKenzie Inn. He had no idea this was to be a night like no other.
Since construction began in 1888, Kirkfield, Ontario's Sir William Mackenzie Inn has been many things, from a private home to a school, even a convent, and now a bed and breakfast. This building has touched the lives of so many people, some of whom have chosen to stay on long after death.
A guest at the inn was leaving for the evening when she heard the sound of piano music drifting through the downstairs rooms. She followed the sound into the billiard parlor and heard the clack of pool balls in this otherwise empty room. Once again, she was startled to hear the sound of music, this time seeing a ghostly young girl seated at the piano. The child looked at her and quickly darted away. She was angry at the woman for interrupting her playing.
Number of reports of seeing a little girl. The previous owners to us in the restaurant reportedly seeing a young girl hidden with sort of shabby knees, dirty knees hidden underneath one of the counters there on a couple of occasions. In one of the closets up on the third floor where the domestic servants used to be during Mackenzie's time. And there's a very large lead-lined cistern up there that holds a whole lot of water. And a couple of different mediums had these impressions that a young girl might have been abused or drowned there, or perhaps even her body was put there after some foul play had come to her. Some people have said that they've seen a ghostly nun walking back and forth between the main residence, the inn, and the gatehouse. And of course, it was the sisters in the early 30s that put the extension on the gatehouse and built it into a two-floor building with the classrooms up there. And there's actually old original signatures on the walls up there of the tradespeople that built it. So there certainly can be a presence there, perhaps.
A noted psychic was staying at the Mackenzie Inn. She was awakened with the sensation of the entire room rocking, as if shaken by giant hands. An unseen force began pulling at her bedsheets, terrifying her. Without a moment's hesitation, she ran from the room. The next day, she decided not to leave the inn. Rather, she chose to hold a séance, assisted by one of the staff who had also experienced unexplainable events at the inn. As the séance progressed, she began to make contact with spirits. The first was an entity who identified herself as Sister Mary. The psychic asked her to move on in peace, but Sister Mary refused, claiming there was work to be done and she would not leave until it was completed. As the séance continued, the psychic made contact with a second presence who identified herself as Nellie. Nellie was apparently a housekeeper at the inn during the 1800s who stayed on because she loved the house so much. The psychic was exhausted, and the séance came to a close. The psychic detected that Sister Mary was there protecting the little girl seen by so many. Feeling she had failed to protect her in life, she was compelled to do so in death. That night, the psychic was awakened by a blinding blue light. She didn't know what to make of it until she looked over and saw the figure of Nellie knitting peacefully. Amazingly, the psychic remained calm and felt an overwhelming sense of warmth and joy emanating from Nellie. Nellie vanished, and the room returned to normal. But those feelings remained with the psychic ever since. Feelings reported by many fortunate guests at the Sir William McKenzie Inn. The present owners and many of the guests can't deny that they are not alone, a simple fact that they have chosen to accept. And the spirits who linger at the McKenzie Inn have made sure that those who check in as rigid skeptics always check out as true believers. In 1763, the road leading from Quebec City to the village of Lévis was deathly silent. A young woman made her way home, stopping to gather firewood along the way. As she passed the crossroads leading to Quebec City, she paused to marvel at the terrifying spectacle that hung there. The body of a woman had been placed in an iron cage and hung in the shadow of a large wooden cross. It was the body of a convicted murderess and witch. Summoning all her courage, she defiantly hurled pieces of firewood at the skeletal remains, cursing the evil woman. Suddenly, an unearthly moaning filled the night, and eerie shadows moved through the fog, and fear ran through her like a knife. She ran, but wherever she looked, she saw something in the fog and heard the moaning. She would never again challenge the power of the woman known as La Corriveau.
Occasionally, a ghost story goes beyond being a tale and becomes an integral part of local culture. In Quebec City, the story of La Corriveau is just that. A woman found guilty of witchcraft and murder has become a beloved part of Quebec history.
The legend of La Corriveau has a real special meaning to the people here in Quebec. When I came here, it was just something that they were constantly talking about. So after an extensive amount of research, the one thing that I did uncover is that there wasn't one story about this woman that was exactly the same.
Historical records show that Marie Corriveau was a beautiful young woman who lived near Quebec City during the 1760s. She had many suitors and eventually married. They settled down to what her husband hoped would be a normal life. He didn't know that Marie had a secret occupation. When her husband was away, she would place a lantern in the window. This was a signal to her customers that it was safe to enter by the back door. This secrecy was vital, as Marie's business was witchcraft. Marie had been a practicing witch since childhood and had a very successful business selling her charms and potions to wealthy customers. Her real expertise, though, was creating undetectable poisons, and murder became Marie's specialty. Marie kept her business a secret from her husband until he came upon some of her charms. As a devout churchgoer, he was horrified and ordered her to end these pagan practices. Marie reluctantly agreed, promising to become a good and dutiful wife. For a short time, she lived up to her promise, and their home became a model of domestic tranquility. Marie's husband was content, feeling he would once again have the pretty and obedient wife he had hoped for. Marie did not share his contentment and had no intentions of giving up her profitable business. Perhaps if Marie's husband had been aware of her expertise in the area of untraceable poisons, he would have been less trusting. Marie used all of her experience to create a very special surprise for her husband. She had been experimenting with mercury, which in combination with other elements was a deadly poison. One morning, as her husband quietly slept, Marie entered the bedroom, carrying her newest creation. It took only a few drops poured directly into the sleeping victim's ear. The effects were almost instantaneous. The acid-like combination of mercury and other elements burned through his eardrum and into his brain. He died horribly as Marie looked on. In a tribute to her skills, Marie's poison was undetected, and it was declared that her husband died naturally of a stroke, leaving her to continue her profitable business unencumbered.
As I said, there have been many books written about Le Corriveau. Many of them have said she had 20 husbands. Many of them said she had 7 husbands, of which she'd murdered all of them. But the most consistent seems to be she had 2 of them.
Marie's widowhood was rather short-lived, and a few months later she remarried, this time to a prosperous trader who was away much of the time. At first, she settled into the facade of married life, but eventually her new husband began to ask too many questions and seemed suspicious. Marie began to feel he was a liability and decided to take action. Once again, she crept into the bedroom. This time, her technique was less subtle. She simply used a meat cleaver. She dragged the body to a nearby stable and tearfully claimed her husband had been trampled to death. The authorities did not believe her tale. Then Marie deviously accused her own father of the murder, and he was tried and sentenced. Her father confessed to a priest that he had pled guilty only to protect his daughter. Marie was quickly arrested, and the press dubbed her Le Corriveau. She was tried and sentenced to hang. This was the first death warrant issued by the new British government. With her dying breath, she cursed her accusers and swore she would return from the grave, and perhaps she did.
She was hung, and then her body was placed into an iron cage that had been made to look like a human body. This cage was hung up on public display, which was a big punishment for the British at that time. And that's when the ghost sightings started. Many of the residents of Levy, where this cage was hung up, said that they were seeing ghost sightings of Le Corriveau during the night. They heard blood-curdling screams coming from this cage. It was extremely terrifying. Finally, they couldn't stand anymore, and they demanded that the British authorities bury that cage.
A passing vagrant who was unaware of the strange events surrounding the cage was hired to remove it. So feared was Le Corriveau that no local person would accept the job. For a few shillings, he was told to drag the cage into the forest and bury it in an unmarked grave. Though he did not know the legend of Le Corriveau, fear ran through him from the moment he touched the cage. As he dragged it off, he heard sounds from nearby woods, low, unintelligible whispers. But the starving man, desperate for a few shillings, pressed on. He buried the cage at a secret location, and in this unmarked grave, the legend of Le Corriveau should have ended. For over a century, the forest was quiet until workmen dug up the unmarked grave. Knowing the legend of Le Corriveau and the value of the cage, a famous showman made a very regrettable decision.
The wonderful legendary circus person P.T. Barnum came up here and bought that cage, and he hung it up in the American Museum in New York City. Now, no sooner was that cage hung up on the 4th floor when a terrible fire broke out at the museum, which eventually burned it right to the ground. And unfortunately, so did that cage burn and melt, which put an end to one of Quebec's most infamous murderesses. With this cage, there came some unnerving experiences, such as the museum burning down to the ground, the apparitions of Le Corriveau, the screaming noises. One can say that this cage certainly contributed to the legend of Le Corriveau.
Though Marie Corriveau's infamous cage was destroyed with Barnum's museum, more than just her story survives. Perhaps the spirit of Quebec's most beloved and notorious legend will live on forever at the crossroads leading into the city.